The briefing room went silent the moment she walked in. Not the respectful kind of silence that greets a decorated pilot. The other kind. The kind that follows rumors. Commander Voss stood at the front, arms crossed, watching the reaction spread through the 20-odd operators seated in metal chairs. Navy SEALs don't startle easily, but several of them exchanged glances when they saw the woman in the flight suit. She was shorter than most of them expected. Her hair was pulled back tight, regulation perfect, and her face carried the kind of weathered calm that only comes from years in a cockpit. But it wasn't her appearance that made the room uncomfortable. It was her call sign, printed on the patch velcroed to her chest, Reaper, and beneath it, in smaller letters, a number that made no sense to anyone who didn't know her file, 140720009. Lieutenant Colonel Nora Kine didn't acknowledge the stares. She'd stopped caring about them somewhere over Helmand Province, back when she was still trying to prove herself. She moved to the side of the room and set her helmet on a table, the worn paint and faded decals telling a story her mouth never would. Voss cleared his throat. The operation brief began. Hostile territory, high-value target, extraction window measured in minutes, not hours. Standard stuff for this crew. Then Voss said the words that changed the temperature in the room. Your close air support will be solo, one aircraft, one pilot. He nodded toward Kine. Call sign Reaper, A-10 Warthog. She'll be your guardian angel for the entire operation. A SEAL near the back, broad-shouldered and skeptical, leaned over to his teammate. His voice was low but not low enough. They're sending one pilot in a hog for this. Kine didn't turn her head. She'd heard worse. Voss stepped forward, his voice hard. Reaper has more combat hours in the A-10 than anyone currently flying. She's kept more ground units alive than most of you have seen firefights. You'll do your job. She'll do hers. Questions? No one spoke, but the doubt hung in the air like smoke. Kine finally looked up, her eyes scanning the room with the detached calm of someone who had already decided she didn't need their approval. She'd earned her place in blood and turbulence and the screams of men she'd saved who never saw her face. The SEALs would learn. They always did, just not the way they expected. The mission launched at 0:30 under a moonless sky. The team moved in two Black Hawks, rotors chopping through cold air as they crossed into hostile airspace. Kine was already airborne, 30,000 feet above them, her A-10 Thunderbolt II cruising in a wide orbit. The aircraft was a beast, ugly and beloved in equal measure. Twin turbofan engines mounted high on the fuselage. Titanium bathtubs surrounding the cockpit. A 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon built into the nose, capable of firing depleted uranium rounds that could shred armor like paper. It wasn't fast. It wasn't pretty. But it was exactly what you wanted overhead when everything went sideways. Kine's hands rested lightly on the stick and throttles, her eyes moving in a practiced rhythm between the heads-up display, the targeting pod feed, and the horizon beyond the canopy. She'd flown this bird for 11 years. Every vibration, every sound, every subtle shift in handling was a language she spoke fluently. The radio crackled. Reaper, this is Shepherd 1. We are 5 minutes from insertion. Confirm your position. Kine clicked the transmit button. Shepherd 1 Reaper, I have you visual, holding at Angels 30 southwest of target zone. Sensors active. No immediate threats detected. Copy Reaper. Stay frosty. Intel says this area's been quiet, but Intel's been wrong before. Roger that. Kine adjusted her scan pattern, eyes narrowing on the infrared feed from her targeting pod. The terrain below was a patchwork of hills and valleys, scattered compounds glowing faintly in thermal signature. Quiet didn't mean safe. It just meant the enemy was patient. The Black Hawks descended rapidly, flaring hard as they touched down in a dry riverbed 2 clicks from the target compound. 12 SEALs spilled out, weapons up, moving fast and low toward the objective. Kine watched them on her screen, tiny green shapes against the dark earth. Shepherd 1's voice came through again. Reaper, we are moving to objective. Request you stay overhead and monitor east approach. That's our most likely avenue for enemy response. Copy. Monitoring east approach. Kine banked the A-10 gently, lining up her orbit to give her the best view of the eastern valley. Her right hand hovered near the weapons panel. The GAU-8 was loaded and ready. So were the AGM-65 Mavericks mounted under her wings, and the Hydra rocket pods, and the GBU-12 laser-guided bombs. She carried enough ordnance to flatten a small army. The SEALs reached the compound. Breaching charges blew the doors. The operation was smooth, professional, textbook. Kine allowed herself a slow breath. Maybe this would be an easy one. Then the eastern valley lit up. Muzzle flashes, dozens of them. Kine's eyes snapped to the thermal feed. Vehicles moving fast, technicals mounted with heavy machine guns, troops dismounting and spreading into attack positions. Her pulse didn't spike. It never did anymore. She just pressed the transmit button. Shepherd 1, Reaper. You have enemy contact inbound from the east. Multiple vehicles, approximately 40 to 50 combatants moving fast on your position. The response came back clipped and tense. Reaper, Shepherd 1, we are still inside the compound, interrogating the HVT. We need more time. Copy, I'll buy you time. Kine pushed the stick forward, rolling the A-10 into a steep dive. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 30,000 feet, 25, 20. The aircraft shuddered slightly as it accelerated, wind howling past the canopy. She pulled up hard at 8,000 feet, leveling out directly above the advancing enemy column. Her targeting reticle settled over the lead vehicle. She didn't hesitate. Her thumb pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared. It was a sound unlike anything else in modern warfare. A deep, guttural bellow that lasted 2 seconds and sent 70 rounds of 30mm death downrange at 4,000 rounds per minute. The lead technical disintegrated. Fire and metal and bodies scattered across the desert floor. The column behind it slammed to a halt, troops diving for cover. Kine pulled up, banking hard left, cycling her targeting pod to the next vehicle. The radio exploded with voices. Contact east, we're taking fire. Reaper, we need gun runs on those trucks now. Shepherd 3 is hit, man down. Kine's voice cut through the chaos, calm and measured. Shepherd 1, Reaper, confirm you want danger close fire support. Enemy is within 200 meters of your position. Reaper, light them up. We can't extract with that force intact. Copy. Guns inbound. She rolled inverted, pulling the nose down again, lining up the next pass. The world outside her canopy spun, earth and sky trading places. She'd done this 1,000 times. Her body knew the G-forces, the angles, the exact moment to roll, wings level, and fire. The A-10 screamed down and she pressed the trigger again. Another burst. Another vehicle erupted in flames. The enemy scattered, firing wildly into the sky. Tracers arced up toward her, glowing lines of desperation. None came close. Kine pulled off target, climbing hard, breathing steady. The SEALs were still inside. She had to keep the wolves at bay. The second pass was uglier. The enemy had regrouped, spreading out along a ridgeline that gave them cover and elevation. Smart, disciplined, not the usual ragtag militia. Kine noted it but didn't dwell on it. Threat assessment could wait. Right now she had 12 Americans on the ground who needed her. She keyed the radio. Shepherd 1, Reaper. Enemy has repositioned to the ridgeline northeast of your position. I'm seeing crew-served weapons, possibly 50 cals or heavier. Do you have eyes on? Negative, Reaper. We're buttoned up inside. HVT is secured, but we've got wounded. We need immediate extract. Copy. I'll suppress the ridgeline. Stand by. Kine switched her weapon selection to rockets. The Hydra pods mounted under her wings carried 19 2.75-inch rockets each. Unguided, brutal, effective. She nosed the A-10 toward the ridgeline, descending to 4,000 feet. The targeting pipper on her HUD danced across the terrain as she made minute adjustments with the stick. The ridgeline filled her windscreen. She could see the muzzle flashes now, bright even through the thermal overlay. Her finger squeezed the trigger. A salvo of rockets streaked forward, contrails twisting behind them. They impacted in a rippling chain of explosions that walked across the ridgeline like the fist of an angry god. Smoke and fire and debris fountained into the air. The muzzle flashes stopped. Kine pulled up hard, her body pressed into the seat by the G-forces. The airframe groaned but held. It always did. The A-10 was built to take punishment. To give it to, the radio crackled. Reaper, Shepherd 1, good hits. Enemy fire has ceased. We are moving to extract point now. Copy, I'll maintain overwatch. Kine climbed back to altitude, scanning for threats. Her fuel gauge caught her eye. She'd been airborne for 2 hours now, most of it in combat maneuvers. She had maybe 40 minutes left before she'd need to head for the tanker. 40 minutes to keep the SEALs alive. The Black Hawks appeared on her radar inbound from the west. Fast movers, pilots who knew what they were doing. She watched the SEALs sprint from the compound toward the riverbed, carrying their wounded, dragging the HVT in flexicuffs. Professional, fast. The helicopters flared, touching down in clouds of dust. The team loaded up in under 90 seconds. Kine allowed herself a small nod of approval. Then the Southern Valley erupted. More vehicles, more troops. A second force, larger than the first, sweeping in fast. Kine's eyes went cold. She didn't curse, didn't panic, she just did the math. The helicopters were on the ground, exposed, rotors still spooling up. The enemy was less than a kilometer out and closing fast with heavy weapons. She had maybe 90 seconds before those Black Hawks were shredded. Shepherd 1, Reaper. You have a second enemy element inbound from the south. Heavy weapons. You need to lift off now. Reaper, we're at max gross weight with the wounded and HVT. We need 30 seconds to get airborne. You don't have 30 seconds. Kine slammed the throttles forward and dove. The A-10 howled as it plummeted toward the deck, gravity and thrust combining into something that felt like controlled violence. Her airspeed climbed, 200 knots, 250, 300. The airframe rattled. She ignored it. Her targeting reticle swept across the Southern Valley. She could see them now. 8 vehicles, technicals with mounted machine guns. One with what looked like a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun. That one had to die first. She selected a Maverick missile, locked the infrared seeker onto the Zu-23 technical and fired. The missile leapt off the rail with a flash and a roar, motor burning white-hot as it accelerated downrange. 5 seconds later, the technical vanished in a fireball. The other vehicles swerved, realizing they were being hunted from above. Too late. Kine rolled wings level at 1,000 feet, far lower than doctrine recommended, and held down the trigger. The GAU-8 sang its terrible song. A river of fire poured from the sky. 2 more technicals exploded. A third flipped over, shredded by 30mm rounds that tore through metal and flesh without distinction. Behind her, she heard the Black Hawks lifting off, rotors biting air. Reaper, Shepherd 1, we are airborne. Get clear, you're danger close to your own gun run. Kine pulled up hard, her vision tunneling slightly from the G-forces. She blinked it away, scanning her instruments. The helicopters were climbing, gaining speed, heading west toward safety. The remaining enemy vehicles were retreating, their advance broken. She'd done her job. The radio was silent for a moment. Then a new voice came through. Calm, respectful, one of the SEALs. Reaper, Shepherd 3. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Kine didn't reply. She just turned west and followed the helicopters home. The debrief happened 6 hours later in a tent that smelled like diesel fuel and bad coffee. The SEALs sat in a loose semicircle, still wearing their kit, faces streaked with dust and dried sweat. Kine stood off to the side, helmet under her arm, listening as Commander Voss walked through the mission timeline. When he reached the part about the Southern Valley engagement, he paused and looked at her. Reaper engaged enemy forces at 1,000 feet AGL while directly over friendly forces. That's well below minimum safe altitude for gun runs. She put herself between the enemy and the extract birds and held that position until the helos were clear. The room was quiet, a different kind of quiet than before. Voss continued. Thanks to her actions, all personnel extracted successfully with no additional casualties. The HVT is in custody. Mission success. One of the SEALs, the broad-shouldered skeptic from the briefing, raised his hand. Voss nodded at him. Sir, I'd like to say something. Go ahead, Chief. The SEAL turned to Kine. His face was serious, no trace of the earlier doubt. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I didn't think one pilot in a hog could cover an op this heavy. I was wrong. You saved our asses out there. Thank you. Kine met his eyes. She didn't smile, but something in her expression softened. You did your job, Chief. I did mine. That's how it works. Another SEAL spoke up, younger with a southern accent. Ma'am, can I ask about your call sign, Reaper, and the date on your patch? What's that about? The room shifted. Everyone wanted to know, but no one had wanted to ask. Kine was silent for a long moment. Then she set her helmet on the table. The worn paint was visible in the fluorescent light. faded kill marks, scorch marks from a fire that shouldn't have been survivable. She spoke quietly, but her voice carried. July 14th, 2009. I was flying CAS for a Marine patrol in Helmand. They got ambushed in a valley, pinned down, taking casualties. I was the only air asset in range. I flew 11 consecutive gun runs, some of them under 100 feet, to keep the enemy off them while medevac arrived. She paused, her eyes distant. 43 Marines were in that patrol. 43 made it out alive, not because of me, because I had the right aircraft in the right position at the right time. The Marines started calling me Reaper after that, said I brought death to the enemy but life to them. The room was absolutely still. The date made sense now. Kyne's hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers tracing the worn fabric of her flight gloves. She didn't look at the seals. She looked at the helmet, at the ghost of the pilot she'd been 16 years ago. The A-10 isn't fast, it isn't stealthy. Most people think it's outdated. But when you're on the ground and everything's gone to hell, when you're bleeding and surrounded and the world's trying to kill you, this aircraft shows up and it doesn't leave. It stays. It fights. It brings you home. Picked up the helmet, turned it in her hands. I've flown 273 combat missions. I've fired over 18,000 rounds from the GAU-8. I've dropped enough ordnance to level a city block. And every single time it was to protect people like you. People who run toward the danger so others don't have to. The skeptical SEAL, the chief, stood up. The rest of the team followed. It wasn't a formal thing, no orders given, but the respect in the gesture was unmistakable. Voss watched, saying nothing. Kyne nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and then she turned and walked out of the tent. The night air was cold, clean, a relief after the stale heat inside. She looked up at the sky. Stars everywhere, dense and bright in the desert darkness. Somewhere overhead, another A-10 was flying a patrol, another pilot keeping watch over another group of warriors on the ground. The lineage continued. It always would. Behind her, she heard the SEALs talking, their voices low but animated. They were telling stories now, stories of other missions, other close calls, other pilots who'd saved their lives. The brotherhood of the battlefield, the tribe that mattered. Kyne allowed herself a small smile. She'd earned it today. Again. The same way she'd earned it every day for 16 years. Not with words or politics or charm. With precision and courage and the kind of cold competence that turned skeptics into believers. She walked toward the flight line where her A-10 sat on the tarmac, ground crew already swarming over it, refueling, rearming, checking systems. The aircraft looked battered in the floodlights, scorched paint, dents from shrapnel. Hydraulic fluid staining the concrete beneath the wings. Beautiful. She reached out and touched the fuselage, her palm flat against the cool titanium. "Good girl," she murmured. "Let's do it again tomorrow." The A-10 didn't answer. It never did, but Kyne knew it would be ready. It always was. 3 weeks later, the tasking came down for another high-risk op. Different team. Same region. Same ugly terrain that swallowed helicopters and killed the unprepared. Kyne was in the squadron-ready room when her flight lead, Major Garrett, called her over. He was older, graying at the temples, with the kind of lined face that came from too many deployments and not enough sleep. "Reaper, your primary CAS for Operation Sledgehammer. Briefs at 1800. Kyne nodded. "What's the team?" "MARSOC. Raiders, they specifically requested you." She raised an eyebrow. "Specifically?" Garrett grinned. "Word gets around. The SEALs have been talking. Apparently, you made an impression." Kyne didn't respond, but something flickered in her eyes. Pride, maybe. Or just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd changed minds with actions instead of arguments. The brief that evening was standing room only. The Raiders were a different breed than the SEALs, leaner, harder, with a reputation for taking the jobs no one else wanted. Their commander, a scarred gunnery sergeant named Rains, stood at the front and didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're going after a bomb maker. High-value target. He's responsible for IEDs that have killed 18 coalition troops in the last 2 months. Intel puts him in a compound deep in the mountains, surrounded by hostiles and terrain that'll chew up our exfil if anything goes wrong." Rains looked directly at Kyne. "We need CAS that won't flinch when things get tight. I'm told you're the one to call." Kyne met his gaze. "I'll be overhead. You get in trouble, I'll get you out." Rains nodded, and something passed between them. An understanding. A contract signed not in words but in the shared language of those who'd survived too many close calls. The mission launched at dawn. The terrain was worse than advertised. Jagged peaks, narrow valleys, high winds that buffeted Kine's A-10 as she climbed to altitude. She adjusted her flight path, compensating for the turbulence, her eyes scanning the mountain ridges that rose like broken teeth from the earth. The raiders inserted via Osprey, fast-roping into a clearing barely large enough to hold the aircraft. Kine watched them move out, small figures against the vast stone landscape. The radio was quiet for the first 20 minutes, then everything exploded. The raiders had walked into a kill zone. Ambush, perfectly executed. Heavy machine gun fire from 3 directions, mortars dropping into the clearing, RPGs streaking from the ridgelines. Rain's voice came through the radio, strained but controlled. "Reaper, Warhorse 1, we are in contact. Heavy fire from the north, east, and west ridges. We need immediate suppression." Kine was already rolling in. "Warhorse 1, Reaper, confirm you want guns on the ridges. Provide direction of friendly forces." "Friendlies are in the clearing, taking cover behind rocks. Everything on the ridges is hostile, clear to engage." "Copy. Guns inbound on the north ridge." Kine nosed the A-10 down into a screaming dive. The mountains rose up around her, close enough that she could see individual trees, individual rocks. The HUD painted targeting data across her vision. She ignored most of it, relying on her eyes, her instincts, the feel of the aircraft responding to her inputs. The north ridge filled her canopy. She could see the muzzle flashes, the enemy fighters scrambling for better positions. Her thumb pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared, the entire aircraft shuddering from the recoil. A line of destruction tore across the ridge. Rocks exploded, trees disintegrated, bodies tumbled down the slope. Kine pulled off hard, banking left, already lining up the next target. "Warhorse 1, Reaper, north ridge is suppressed, moving to east ridge." "Copy, Reaper. Be advised we're taking mortar fire." "Can't identify the source." Kine scanned her targeting pod feed, searching for the telltale heat signature of a mortar tube. There, hidden in a depression on the west ridge. She selected a Maverick, locked the seeker, fired. The missile streaked downrange and obliterated the mortar position in a flash of fire. "Warhorse 1, mortar eliminated. You should have relief from indirect fire." "Confirmed, Reaper. Mortars have stopped. You're a goddamn artist." Kine didn't reply. She was already rolling in on the east ridge, her finger squeezing the trigger again. The GAU-8 sang. The enemy broke. Some retreated, some died. The clearing below was a chaos of smoke and dust and shouting Marines, but the volume of incoming fire was dropping. Kine climbed, circling, scanning for new threats. Her fuel was getting low. She'd need to hit the tanker soon. But not yet, not until the raiders were clear. The extraction was textbook chaos. The Osprey returned, rotors tilting forward as it transitioned from helicopter to airplane mode, touching down in the clearing just long enough for the raiders to scramble aboard. Kine maintained a high orbit, her eyes glued to the targeting pod feed. The enemy was regrouping, preparing for another assault. She wouldn't let them. "Warhorse 1, Reaper, you are clear of the LZ. Enemy is massing on the south ridge. Request permission to engage." Rain's voice came back, slightly breathless. "Reaper, you are cleared hot, light them up." Kine rolled inverted and pulled the nose down one last time. The A-10 dropped like a stone, altimeter unwinding, airspeed climbing. She leveled out at 500 feet, impossibly low, the ridgeline flashing past her wingtips. The enemy was there, clustered in a draw, thinking they were hidden. They weren't. She fired. The GAU-8 emptied the last of its ammunition in one sustained burst, 300 rounds in 6 seconds. The draw became a graveyard. Kine pulled up, the airframe groaning, her vision graying at the edges. She blinked it away and leveled off, breathing slowly. Her ammunition counter read 0. Her fuel was at minimum. She keyed the radio. "Warhorse 1, Reaper, Winchester on guns, RTB for fuel and rearm. You are clear." "Copy, Reaper. We're safe thanks to you." "Drinks on me when we get back." Kine allowed herself a faint smile. "I'll hold you to that." She turned west toward the tanker, the mountains falling away beneath her. The A-10 flew straight and true, the titanium bathtub around her cockpit bearing new scars but still intact. still protecting, still fighting. In the back of her mind, she tallied the missions. 274 now, and counting. She didn't do it for medals or recognition. She did it because someone had to. Because the men on the ground needed someone in the sky who wouldn't leave, wouldn't quit, wouldn't fail. She did it because she'd made a promise 16 years ago in a valley in Helmand, when 43 Marines had looked up at the sky and seen hope in the form of an ugly, unstoppable aircraft. She did it because she was Reaper, and the Reaper didn't stop until the job was done. Back at base, Kine taxied her A-10 into the revetment and shut down the engines. The sudden silence was almost disorienting after hours of turbine whine and radio chatter. She sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands resting on her knees, breathing slowly. The ground crew chief appeared at her ladder, a wiry sergeant named Tors who'd been working A-10s longer than Kine had been flying them. He looked up at her, grinning. "Ma'am, you put some new holes in my bird." Kine unstrapped and climbed down, pulling off her helmet. "Not my fault the bad guys can't shoot straight." Tors laughed, but his eyes were serious as he walked around the aircraft, inspecting the damage. There were new dents in the fuselage, fresh scorch marks on the wings, and a hydraulic line that was weeping fluid. "You brought her back. That's what matters." Kine nodded. She trusted Tors and his crew to fix whatever needed fixing. The A-10 was built to be maintainable, to be repairable in the field with minimal tools. It was part of what made the aircraft so effective. You could beat it to hell and it would still fly. She walked toward the operations building, her flight suit stiff with dried sweat. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and red. Beautiful and deadly, like everything else in this place. Inside, the intelligence officer was waiting. Captain Mendoza, sharp-eyed and meticulous, with a tablet full of post-mission data. "Reaper, good work today. BDA confirms 15 enemy KIA, multiple weapon systems destroyed. The raiders made it out with the HVT and no friendly casualties." Kine nodded. Battle damage assessment was always approximate, always sanitized. The reality was uglier, more visceral, but the mission had succeeded. That was what mattered. Mendoza hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "The Raiders' commander, Gunnery Sergeant Rains, submitted a commendation for you. Said you saved his entire team. That's the second commendation in 3 weeks from 2 different units." Kine's expression didn't change. "I was doing my job. I know, but not everyone does it like you." Mendoza left and Kine was alone in the room. She sat down heavily, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving her tired and hollow. This was the part no one talked about. The part after the mission when the silence returned and you had to sit with what you'd done. She'd killed people today, a lot of them. It never got easier, but it never got harder either. She'd long ago accepted that this was the cost of keeping her people alive. That night Kine lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by flashes of the day's mission. The dive, the ridgeline, the muzzle flashes, the Osprey lifting off with the raiders safely aboard. She'd had the dream before, the same one that had visited her for 16 years. She was back in Helmand, flying low over the valley, the Marines pinned down below. But in the dream, she was always too late. The medevac didn't arrive. The enemy overran the position. And she circled above, helpless, watching men die. She woke up at 0300, breathing hard, her heart pounding. The bunk room was dark and quiet. Around her, other pilots slept, oblivious. Kine swung her legs out of bed and sat there for a moment, head in her hands. Then she stood, pulled on her boots and jacket and walked outside. The flight line was empty, the aircraft's silent shapes in the darkness. She walked to her A-10, the one she'd flown earlier, now patched and refueled and waiting for the next mission. She climbed up the ladder and sat in the cockpit, not to fly, just to be there. The seat molded to her body, familiar and comforting. The stick fit her hand perfectly. She looked out through the canopy at the stars and thought about the men she'd saved. The Marines in Helmand. The SEALs 3 weeks ago. The Raiders today. And all the others scattered across 274 missions, faces she'd never seen, names she'd never know. She'd given them something, a chance, a few more minutes, a way home, and in return they'd given her purpose. A reason to keep flying, keep fighting, keep living. The nightmares were the price. She could pay it. Kine climbed down and walked back to the bunk room. She didn't sleep, but she rested. And when dawn came, she was ready to do it all again. Because somewhere someone was going to need her, and she would be there. In the sky, in the titanium bathtub with the GAU-8 loaded and ready, watching, protecting, reaping death for the enemy and life for the living. That was her calling. That was her legacy, and she would carry it until the day she couldn't fly anymore. 6 months passed. The deployment wore on. Kine flew mission after mission, each one blurring into the next. Some were quiet, routine patrols that ended with nothing but flight hours logged. Others were desperate scrambles, danger-close gun runs that left her aircraft battered and her nerves frayed. The respect she'd earned from the SEALs and Raiders spread. Word traveled through the special operations community like wildfire. If you were going into bad terrain, you wanted Reaper overhead. She didn't fly every mission, but when things looked particularly ugly, commanders requested her by name. It was unprecedented, and it was exhausting. Major Garrett pulled her aside one afternoon. They were standing on the flight line watching a pair of A-10s taxi out for a patrol. "Reaper, I need to talk to you." Kine turned, reading the concern in his face. "What's wrong?" "You're flying too much. You've logged more combat hours in the last 6 months than any other pilot in the squadron. Hell, more than most pilots log in an entire deployment." "I'm fine." "You're not fine, you're burning out, I can see it." Kine looked away, jaw tight. "People need me in the air. People need you alive. If you keep this pace, you're going to make a mistake. And mistakes in the A-10 get people killed." She wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She'd felt it herself, the way her concentration slipped sometimes, the way her hands shook after particularly rough missions. The nightmares were coming more frequently. She was running on fumes. Garrett's voice softened. "Take a week. Go to Qatar, sit on a beach, drink something that isn't instant coffee, come back fresh." Kine nodded slowly. "Okay. I mean it, Reaper, 1 week, that's an order." She took the week, flew out on a transport to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where the tempo was slower and the accommodations were almost civilized. She tried to relax, read books she'd been meaning to read. Ate food that didn't come out of a pouch, slept in a real bed. It should have been restful, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ridgelines, the muzzle flashes, the Marines in the valley. She wondered who was flying CAS while she was gone, whether they were good enough, whether someone would die because she wasn't there. Guilt gnawed at her. By the 5th day, she couldn't take it anymore. Kine cut her leave short and hitched a ride back to the forward operating base. When she walked into the squadron ready room, Major Garrett looked up from his desk and sighed. "You couldn't even make it a week." "I tried." "I know you did." He gestured to a chair. She sat. Garrett leaned back, studying her. "You know what your problem is, Reaper. You think you're the only one who can do this job. You think if you're not in the air, people will die. They will. Maybe, maybe not, but you can't save everyone. And if you kill yourself trying, then you save no one." Kine stared at the floor. She knew he was right, but knowing it and accepting it were different things. Garrett's voice gentled. "I'm not grounding you, but I am limiting your flight schedule. You'll fly every other day, Max, and you'll talk to the flight surgeon about the nightmares." "I'm fine, that wasn't a request." Kine met his eyes. She saw the concern there, the fear that one of his pilots was teetering on the edge of something dark. She nodded. "Okay." The flight surgeon was a soft-spoken captain named Lee, who listened without judgment as Kine described the dreams, the guilt, the relentless pressure to be perfect. Lee didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. She just said, "What you're experiencing is normal, it's the cost of caring, but you have to find a way to carry it or it'll bury you." "How?" "Talk to other pilots. They're carrying the same weight, share the load." It sounded simple. It wasn't. But Kine started attending the informal gatherings in the evenings, where pilots swapped stories and drank near beer and processed the things they couldn't say in official debriefs. She didn't talk much at first, but she listened. And slowly, she realized she wasn't alone. Every pilot in the squadron carried ghosts. Every one of them had missions they replayed in their heads, wondering if they could have done better, saved more, been faster. The difference was they carried it together, and that made it bearable. Kine started flying every other day as ordered. It felt wrong at first, like she was shirking responsibility, but the rest helped. Her hands steadied, her concentration sharpened, and when she did fly, she was better, sharper, more precise. Garrett had been right, she couldn't save everyone, but she could save some, and that had to be enough. 3 months later, the call came that Kine had been dreading. A medevac helicopter had gone down in hostile territory. Crew of 4, plus 2 critically wounded soldiers they'd been transporting. The crash site was deep in a valley, surrounded by enemy forces, and the weather was deteriorating fast. Every available asset was being scrambled for the rescue. Kine was already in her flight suit when Major Garrett found her. "Reaper, your primary CAS for the rescue op. Launch in 15 minutes. She nodded, her face grim. Helicopter rescues were the worst. The aircrew would be injured, possibly unable to defend themselves, and the enemy would converge on the crash site like sharks smelling blood. This was going to be ugly. She sprinted to her A-10 where Torres and his crew were already prepping the aircraft. They worked in coordinated silence, loading munitions, checking systems, topping off fuel. Torres caught her eye as she climbed into the cockpit. "Bring them home, ma'am. That's the plan." Kine strapped in, her hands moving through the startup checklist with practiced speed. Engines online. Systems check. Weapons armed. Radio tuned to the rescue frequency. She taxied out and launched into a sky that was already turning ugly, dark clouds rolling in from the east. The weather briefing had predicted thunderstorms by evening. They had maybe 2 hours before the valley became unflyable. The rescue force was a mixed bag. 2 Apache gunships for close support. A Pave Hawk helicopter for the extraction, a flight of F-16s at altitude for top cover, and Kine in her A-10 flying low and slow, ready to put steel on target. The valley appeared ahead, a slash of darkness between jagged peaks. Kine could see the smoke from the crash site, a thin gray column rising into the clouds. "All units, this is Warhorse 6. Crash site is hot. Enemy forces are closing in from the north and east. We need immediate suppression to get the Pave Hawk in." Kine's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Warhorse 6 Reaper, I'm inbound on the north approach. Request confirmation on friendly positions." "Reaper, friendlies are at the crash site marked with orange smoke. Everything else is hostile." "Copy." Kine descended into the valley, her eyes scanning the terrain. The crashed helicopter was a broken shape at the bottom, rotors shattered, fuselage crumpled. She could see figures moving around it, some in flight suits, some in body armor. The aircrew and the wounded soldiers, trying to set up a defensive perimeter with whatever weapons they had. And closing in from the north, a line of enemy fighters moving fast. Kine didn't wait for permission. She rolled in and opened fire. The GAU-8 tore through the enemy line, bodies and weapons scattering like leaves in a storm. She pulled up hard, banking left, and saw the Apache gunships moving into position, their chain guns hammering. The valley echoed with the sounds of war. But the enemy kept coming. They knew what was at stake. If they could overrun the crash site before the rescue helicopter arrived, they could capture or kill 6 Americans. That would be a propaganda victory worth dying for. Kine wouldn't let it happen. She made pass after pass, each gun run lower than the last, her aircraft shuddering from the recoil and the turbulence. Tracers arced up toward her. One round punched through her left aileron. She felt the impact, felt the aircraft buck slightly, but the flight controls still responded. The A-10 kept flying. It always did. "Reaper, Warhorse 6, Pave Hawk is inbound. We need the LZ clear for 30 seconds. "Copy." Kine scanned her weapons panel. She was down to her last Maverick and maybe 200 rounds of 30mm. She'd been in the valley for 20 minutes and it felt like hours. She selected the Maverick, locked it onto a cluster of enemy fighters setting up a machine gun position, and fired. The missile impacted dead center, the explosion rippling outward. "Warhorse 6, LZ is clear. Get them out." The Pave Hawk swept in low and fast, its crew chiefs leaning out with rifles, providing suppressing fire. The helicopter flared and touched down next to the crash site. The rescue was chaos. The aircrew and wounded were loaded aboard in a scramble of hands and shouts in desperation. 20 seconds, 25, 30. The Pave Hawk lifted off, rotors biting air, climbing out of the valley. Kine exhaled slowly. They'd done it. Then an RPG streaked out of the trees and hit the Pave Hawk's tail rotor. The helicopter spun violently, trailing smoke, and crashed back to Earth. Kine's blood turned to ice. Not again, not today. She keyed the radio, her voice hard. All units, Pave Hawk is down. Repeat, Pave Hawk is down. I'm engaging. She dove toward the trees where the RPG had come from, her last 200 rounds loaded and ready. This was it. Her last chance to keep these people alive. The GAU-8 roared one final time and the trees vanished in fire and fury. The enemy position disintegrated under Kine's last burst. She pulled up her ammunition counter reading 0 and circled the valley. The situation was critical. 2 crashed helicopters now, 10 people on the ground, some wounded, all surrounded. And the weather was closing in, thick clouds rolling over the peaks, visibility dropping by the minute. The radio crackled with urgent voices. Warhorse 6, this is Sky 1. We are bingo fuel. We have to RTB. The F-16s were leaving. Horse 6, Viper 2. We're Winchester on Hellfires and critically low on fuel. We can give you 5 more minutes, then we're out. The Apache were leaving too. Kine's fuel gauge showed 20 minutes remaining, maybe less if she stayed low and maneuvering. She keyed the radio. Warhorse 6, Reaper, I'm Winchester on all munitions. I have minimal fuel, but I'm not leaving. There was a pause. Then the voice of the ground commander, strained and disbelieving. Reaper, did you say you have no weapons? Affirmative, but I can still fly, I can draw fire, I can mark targets for the next CAS flight, and I can make the enemy think twice about advancing. Reaper, that's suicide. Kine's voice was calm, almost gentle. No, it's my job. She descended lower, dropping to 300 feet, flying slow circles around the crash sites. The enemy could see her now, hear her, the distinctive sound of the turbofan engines echoing off the valley walls. She was bait, and she knew it. The enemy fired at her. Small arms, machine guns, everything they had. Tracers chased her through the air. Rounds pinged off the titanium bathtub. One hit her canopy, spiderwebbing the glass but not penetrating. The A-10 absorbed it all and kept flying. On the ground, the survivors were fighting hard, their ammunition running low, their situation desperate. But the enemy wasn't advancing. They were too focused on the aircraft circling overhead, the one that had killed so many of them already. Kine checked her fuel. 10 minutes, maybe, the radio crackled. Reaper, Warhorse 7, we are inbound with 2 Apache and a Chinook for extraction. ETA 8 minutes. Can you hold? Kine looked at her fuel gauge, looked at the valley, looked at the people below who needed her. I'll hold. She kept flying. Slower now, the turbines whining, fuel pumps straining. The aircraft was sluggish, heavy, running on fumes, but it stayed in the air, because that's what it was built to do. 7 minutes. 6. 5. The enemy made a final push, realizing they were running out of time. They charged the crash sites, firing wildly. The survivors returned fire, but they were being overrun. Kine had no weapons, but she had one thing left. She dove. The A-10 screamed down toward the enemy fighters, and Kine held the dive longer than she should have, longer than was safe, until she could see their faces, see the shock and fear as the aircraft filled their vision. They scattered, broke, ran. Kine pulled up hard at the last possible second, her vision tunneling, the airframe groaning, every structural component stressed to its limit. She leveled off at 50 feet, her heart pounding, her hands trembling on the stick. The fuel gauge read empty. The low fuel warning light was screaming, but the enemy was broken, and the Chinook was coming in. She climbed slowly, every second an eternity, the engines coughing. The Chinook touched down in a storm of dust and noise. The Apache circled overhead, guns trained on the tree line. The survivors sprinted for the ramp, dragging the wounded, moving as fast as their exhausted bodies allowed. 10 seconds, 20. They were aboard. The Chinook lifted off, climbing fast, escaping the valley. Kine turned west toward base and prayed the engines wouldn't quit. The radio was silent. Everyone was listening, waiting to see if she'd make it. The low fuel warning was constant now, a shrill alarm that filled the cockpit. Kine ignored it. She focused on the horizon, on the distant airfield, on keeping the aircraft straight and level. 1 mile, 2. The base appeared ahead, the runway lights bright in the gathering dusk. She keyed the radio, her voice hoarse. Tower, Reaper. Emergency fuel state. Request immediate clearance to land. Reaper Tower, you are cleared to land. Emergency vehicles standing by. Kine lined up on final approach. The engines coughed once, twice. She lowered the landing gear, feeling the drag, praying the engines would hold. The runway rose up to meet her. She crossed the threshold, flared, and the wheels touched down with a jolt. She applied the brakes and the A-10 rolled to a stop halfway down the runway. The engines quit, both of them, simultaneously. The sudden silence was deafening. Kyne sat in the cockpit, hands still on the stick, breathing hard. The canopy was cracked. The fuselage was riddled with holes. The aircraft was out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of everything. But she'd made it. They'd all made it. The emergency vehicles arrived, crews swarming over the aircraft. Torres was among them, his face pale as he took in the damage. "Jesus, ma'am, how is this thing still in one piece?" Kyne unbuckled and climbed out, her legs shaky. She looked at the A-10, at the battered, beautiful machine that had carried her through hell one more time. "Because it's a warthog," she said quietly. "It doesn't quit." The story spread fast. Within a day, every unit on the base knew what Reaper had done, flying with no weapons, drawing fire, diving on the enemy with nothing but airframe and courage, holding the line until the rescue arrived, landing on fumes, engines quitting the moment the wheels touched down. It was the kind of story that became legend. Major Garrett found her in the squadron briefing room the next morning. She was staring at a cup of coffee, exhausted, her face drawn. "Reaper, I just got off a call with the wing commander. He wants to put you up for the Distinguished Flying Cross." Kyne looked up, surprised. "That's not necessary. It's not about necessity, it's about recognition. What you did yesterday saved 10 lives. You flew an unarmed aircraft into a hot LZ and held off an enemy assault for 8 minutes. That's extraordinary." "I was just doing my job." Garrett sat down across from her. "No, you went beyond the job. You risked your life when you had every reason to leave. That's courage. That's what the medal represents." Kyne was silent for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "If I get the medal, I want the ground commander and his team there for the ceremony. They're the ones who held that perimeter. They're the reason anyone survived." Garrett smiled. "I'll make sure of it." The ceremony happened 2 weeks later. The wing commander pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross to Kyne's uniform in front of the entire squadron. The survivors from the valley stood nearby, still battered, still healing, but alive. When it was over, the ground commander, a hard-eyed sergeant named Diaz, approached her. He didn't salute. He just held out his hand. "Ma'am, you're the reason I get to go home to my daughter. I don't have the words to thank you." Kyne shook his hand, her grip firm. "You held the line on the ground. I just backed you up." "No, ma'am, you didn't just back us up. You stayed when everyone else left. You put yourself between us and death. That's something different. That's something I'll carry for the rest of my life." Kyne nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The other survivors approached, one by one, shaking her hand, offering quiet thanks. She accepted it all with her usual calm, but inside something shifted. She'd spent 16 years flying missions, saving lives, never seeing the faces of the people she protected. Now they were standing in front of her, real, alive, grateful. It made it real in a way it hadn't been before. The deployment ended a month later. Kyne flew her last combat mission on a clear morning, escorting a convoy through a known danger area. Nothing happened. The convoy arrived safely. It was anticlimactic, almost boring, perfect. She landed, taxied to the revetment, and shut down the engines for the final time. Torres was waiting, as always, his eyes misty. "End of an era, ma'am. You've been flying this bird for 289 combat missions. That's a record for the squadron." Kyne climbed down and looked at the A-10. It was scarred, patched, repaired 100 times over, but it was still airworthy, still ready. "Take care of her, Torres. She's got a lot of missions left." "Always, ma'am." Kyne walked away from the flight line, helmet under her arm, the sun warm on her face. She was going home. Back to the States. Back to a world where people didn't shoot at her, where the sky was just the sky and not a battlefield. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt strange, unmoored. She'd spent so long defining herself by the missions, by the fight, that she wasn't sure who she was without it. The flight back was long and uneventful. She slept fitfully on the transport, surrounded by other soldiers and airmen heading home. When they landed at Dover Air Force Base, the reality hit her. The deployment was over. The war for her was paused, but not ended. It never ended for pilots like her. There was always another deployment, another mission, another group of people who needed saving. She checked into her apartment on base, a small, sterile space that felt foreign after months in the desert. She unpacked her gear, stowed her flight suit, and sat on the bed staring at the wall. Her phone buzzed, a text from Major Garrett. "Reaper, heard you made it back safe. Take some time, rest. You've earned it, but don't disappear on us. We're going to need you again." She typed a reply. "I'll be ready." And she would be, because that's what she did. That's who she was. Reaper, the pilot who didn't leave, the one who stayed. The one who brought death to the enemy and life to the living. It was her calling, her burden, her legacy, and she would carry it for as long as she could fly. Kyne spent the next 6 months stateside, assigned to a training squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. It was supposed to be a break, a chance to decompress and pass on her knowledge to younger pilots, but it felt hollow. The new pilots were eager, skilled, hungry to prove themselves, but they hadn't seen what she'd seen, hadn't felt the weight of lives hanging on every decision, every trigger pull, every second of delay. She tried to teach them. Not just the tactics and procedures, but the mindset. The understanding that close air support wasn't about destroying targets, it was about protecting people. "You're not here to rack up kill counts," she told a class of freshly minted A-10 pilots one afternoon. "You're here to bring people home. Every gun run, every bomb drop, every minute you spend in the air is about giving someone on the ground a chance to survive. Don't ever forget that." They nodded, respectful, attentive. But she could see in their eyes that they didn't fully understand. Not yet, they would. Eventually, the way she had, through blood and fear and the weight of responsibility. One of the younger pilots, a lieutenant named Hayes, approached her after the class. He was tall, nervous, with the kind of earnest intensity that reminded Kyne of herself years ago. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you deal with it, the pressure? The knowledge that people are depending on you?" Kyne studied him for a moment. Then she said, "You don't deal with it, you carry it, and you make sure you're good enough that the weight doesn't crush you." "Does it get easier?" "No." Hayes looked shaken, but he nodded, and Kyne respected him for not looking away from the truth. That night, Kyne sat in her apartment and opened her laptop. She'd been avoiding this for months, but she couldn't put it off any longer. She pulled up the casualty reports from her last deployment, the official numbers, the names of the people she'd saved. 43 Marines in Helmand, 12 SEALs, 18 Raiders, 10 survivors from the valley, dozens more scattered across hundreds of missions, and below that the other list. The one no one talked about, the enemy dead. The numbers were staggering. Over 300 confirmed kills attributed directly to her gun runs and missile strikes. 300 people who would never go home. She didn't feel guilt exactly. They'd been trying to kill her people and she'd stopped them. That was the job. But she felt the weight of it. The knowledge that her actions had ended lives, erased futures, created widows and orphans. It was necessary, but it wasn't easy, and it wasn't something to celebrate. Kyne closed the laptop and walked outside. The Arizona night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. She looked up and thought about the pilots who'd come before her, the ones who'd flown A-10s in Desert Storm in Bosnia in the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan. They'd carried the same weight, made the same choices, saved the same lives. The lineage stretched back decades, and it would continue forward long after she was gone. That thought brought her a strange comfort. She wasn't alone in this. She was part of something larger, a tradition of warriors who flew low and slow and dangerous, who put themselves between the enemy and the innocent, who made the hard choices so others didn't have to. Her phone buzzed, a message from Major Garrett. "Reaper, new deployment tasking came down. We're heading back in 4 months. You're on the roster if you want it." Kyne stared at the message for a long time. She could say no. She'd done her time, earned her medals, proven herself 100 times over. No one would blame her for stepping back, taking a desk job, letting someone else carry the weight. But that wasn't who she was. She typed her reply, "I'm in." 4 months later, Kyne was back in the cockpit, back in the desert, back in the fight. The tasking was different this time. The enemy had evolved, adapting to coalition tactics, becoming more sophisticated. But the mission was the same: protect the people on the ground, keep them alive, bring them home. She flew her first mission of the new deployment on a cold morning, escorting a patrol through a contested valley. The radio chatter was familiar, comforting in its routine. "Reaper, this is Phantom 1. We are moving through Sector 7, all quiet so far." "Phantom 1, Reaper, I have you visual, maintaining overwatch." The patrol moved carefully, professionally, checking corners and clearings. Kind circled above, her eyes scanning the terrain, and then she saw it. Heat signature hidden in a compound to the north. Movement, weapons, an ambush being set. She keyed the radio. Phantom 1, Reaper, you have enemy contact preparing to engage from the compound at your 11 o'clock. Multiple hostiles, heavy weapons. The patrol leader didn't hesitate. Reaper, you are cleared hot. Kine rolled in. The GAU-8 roared. The compound erupted in fire. The ambush was broken before it could begin. The patrol moved on safe, unaware of how close they'd come to disaster. And Kine climbed back to altitude, the adrenaline fatting, the routine settling in. This was her life. This was her purpose, and she would fly it for as long as they'd let her. 2 years passed, deployment after deployment, mission after mission. Kine's combat hours climbed past 400. Her kill count rose, her reputation grew. She became something of a legend in the close air support community. Other pilots studied her tactics. Ground commanders requested her by name. The younger generation of A-10 pilots looked up to her with a mix of awe and intimidation. But the cost was mounting. The nightmares were constant now. The weight of the dead, enemy and friendly alike, pressed on her every night. Her hands trembled sometimes when she wasn't flying. Her focus, once unshakable, occasionally slipped. Major Garrett, now a lieutenant colonel, pulled her aside after a particularly rough mission. "Reaper, we need to talk." Kine knew what was coming. "I'm fine." "You're not. You're at the end of your rope. I can see it. The flight surgeon can see it. Hell, everyone in the squadron can see it. I can still fly. I can still do the job." "I know you can, but the question is, should you?" Kine looked away. She didn't have an answer. Garrett's voice softened. "You've given 16 years to this, 437 combat missions, more lives saved than anyone can count. You've earned the right to step back. And do what? Fly a desk, train pilots who will never understand what it's really like. Maybe, or maybe you do something else. Write a book, teach at the academy. Consult for the Air Force on CAS doctrine. There are options, Reaper, but you can't keep flying combat missions forever. No one can." Kine was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly, "I don't know how to stop." "I know, but you have to figure it out before the choice is made for you." That night, Kine sat in her quarters and thought about the future, about what came after. She defined herself by the missions for so long that the idea of life without them felt empty, meaningless. But Garrett was right. She couldn't do this forever. Eventually, age or injury or exhaustion would catch up to her. And when that happened, she wanted it to be on her terms. She made a decision. One more deployment, one more rotation, and then she'd step back. Not retire, not completely, but transition to something different, something that let her pass on what she'd learned without breaking herself in the process. It was the right choice, the smart choice, but it hurt, because flying was all she knew. And the idea of letting go felt like losing a part of herself. Still, she'd made the decision, and she would see it through. One more deployment, one more fight, and then finally rest. The final deployment began in the autumn. The leaves were turning back home, but in the desert nothing changed. Same dust, same heat, same endless sky. Kine flew her first mission with a strange sense of finality. This was the beginning of the end. The squadron had changed. New faces, new pilots, younger and hungrier. Some of them knew her reputation. Others just saw an older pilot, quieter than the rest, with a worn flight suit and a call sign that carried weight. She didn't try to make friends. She just did her job. The missions were routine at first: patrols, convoys, overwatch. The enemy was cautious, probing, testing, but not engaging. It felt like the calm before a storm. And Kine's instincts, honed over 16 years, told her the storm was coming. It came 3 weeks into the deployment. Intelligence reported a major enemy offensive being planned. Multiple targets, coordinated attacks. The goal was to overrun a coalition outpost and capture or kill as many soldiers as possible. A propaganda victory, a blow to morale. The coalition response was immediate. Reinforcements were rushed to the outpost. Air assets were positioned for rapid response. And Kine was assigned as primary close air support. The attack began at dawn. Mortars rained down on the outpost. Suicide bombers struck the perimeter. And then the assault force moved in. Hundreds of fighters, well-armed and determined. The radio exploded with calls for help. "Reaper, this is Wardog 1. We are under heavy assault from the north and east. We need immediate air support." Kine was already airborne 30 miles out. She pushed the throttles forward, the A-10 accelerating as much as it ever did. "Wardog 1, Reaper, I am inbound. ETA 5 minutes, hold on." "Reaper, we don't have 5 minutes. They're inside the wire." Kine's jaw tightened. "Then make it 4. She descended rapidly, the outpost appearing on the horizon, smoke rising from multiple points. She could see the chaos even from miles away. The enemy was everywhere. Kine didn't waste time. She rolled in and opened fire. The GAU-8 sang its song of death and the enemy advanced staggered, but there were too many. She pulled off, reloaded mentally, and rolled in again. And again. And again. For 30 minutes, Kine flew continuous gun runs, expending ammunition at a rate that would have horrified her instructors. But it was working. The enemy was being pushed back, slowly, painfully, inch by inch, and then her aircraft was hit. The explosion was catastrophic. An anti-aircraft missile fired from a hidden launcher slammed into Kine's left engine. The turbine disintegrated in a spray of fire and metal. Alarms screamed. The aircraft yawed hard left, the flight controls sluggish and unresponsive. Kine fought the stick, her hands moving on instinct, shutting down the damaged engine, rerouting hydraulics, trying to keep the A-10 in the air. "Reaper is hit. Reaper is hit." She wasn't sure who said it. Maybe her. Maybe someone on the ground. The world narrowed to the cockpit, the instruments, the desperate fight to keep flying. The A-10 shuddered and bucked, trailing smoke, losing altitude. Kine scanned for a place to land. There was nothing, just enemy territory in every direction. The outpost was too far, she wasn't going to make it back. Her training kicked in. Prepare for ejection. Radio your position. Hope the rescue force gets to you before the enemy does, but ejecting meant abandoning the mission. Abandoning the soldiers on the ground who were still fighting, still dying. Kine looked at her fuel gauge, looked at her remaining weapons, looked at the altimeter. She made a choice. She wasn't ejecting, not yet. She keyed the radio, her voice calm despite the chaos. "All units, Reaper. I am critically damaged but still airborne. Continuing mission." "Reaper, negative. Eject now. You're on fire." Kine ignored the order. She nosed the A-10 toward the outpost, the single remaining engine screaming, the airframe vibrating like it was about to come apart. She had one Maverick left. One. She found her target, the anti-aircraft launcher that had hit her. It was repositioning, getting ready to shoot down the rescue helicopters that would be coming soon. Kine locked the Maverick, her hands steady despite the smoke filling the cockpit, despite the fire warning lights, despite everything. She fired. The missile flew true. The launcher exploded, obliterated, no longer a threat. Kine pulled up, or tried to. The A-10 responded sluggishly, the nose rising, but not enough. She was going to crash, but not here, not in enemy territory. She pointed the aircraft toward the outpost, toward friendly lines, and held on. The ground rose up fast, too fast. She yanked the stick back with all her strength, the airframe groaning, the remaining engine coughing. The A-10 cleared the perimeter wall by 10 feet. And then it hit the ground inside the outpost, hard, skidding across the dirt in a storm of dust and fire and shrieking metal. The impact was brutal. Kine's head slammed into the canopy despite her helmet, her vision blurred. The A-10 skidded for what felt like forever, tearing through tents and barriers and equipment, and then it stopped. Silence. For a moment, Kine just sat there, dazed, unsure if she was alive or dead. Then the pain hit. Her ribs, her shoulder, her head, everything hurt, but she was alive. She fumbled with the canopy release. It didn't move, jammed. Panic clawed at her throat. The smoke was getting thicker. If the fuel caught fire, she'd burn alive. She heard voices, shouting. Hands pounded on the canopy. "Hold on, we'll get you out." Tools appeared, crowbars, a fire axe. The soldiers outside were working frantically, prying at the canopy, smashing the already cracked glass. It took 2 minutes that felt like hours. Then the canopy popped open and hands reached in, pulling her free. Kine collapsed into their arms, coughing, her lungs burning. They dragged her away from the wreckage. She turned her head, looking back at the A-10. It was a ruin. The left side was gone, melted and shredded. The fuselage was cracked. The landing gear had collapsed. It would never fly again, but it had brought her home, one last time. The soldiers lowered her to the ground, a medic appearing with a kit. Kine waved him off. "I'm fine, check the others, the wounded." "Ma'am, you're bleeding. I said check the others." The medic hesitated, then nodded and moved on. Kine sat there, leaning against a concrete barrier, watching the battle continue around her. The enemy was retreating now, their assault broken. Reinforcements were arriving. The outpost would hold. She'd done her job. The ground commander, a captain named Tor's no relation to her crew chief, approached and crouched beside her. His face was blackened with soot, his eyes wide. "Ma'am, you just flew a burning aircraft into the middle of a firefight and crashed inside our perimeter. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen." Kine coughed, wincing. "Seemed like a good idea at the time." Tors laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You saved us again. We were about to be overrun. Your gun runs gave us time to regroup, and that last missile took out the launcher that would have shot down our medevac." Kine nodded slowly. "Good." She closed her eyes, the exhaustion finally overwhelming her. She heard Tors calling for a stretcher, heard the medic returning, felt hands lifting her, and then everything went dark. Kine woke up in a field hospital, her body wrapped in bandages, her head pounding. A doctor stood over her, checking monitors, his expression concerned but relieved. "Welcome back, Colonel. You've been out for 6 hours." Kine tried to sit up. Pain lanced through her ribs and she gasped. "Easy. You've got 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, and more cuts and bruises than I can count. You're lucky to be alive. The outpost? Secure, thanks to you." Kine nodded and lay back, her eyes closing. The doctor left and she was alone with her thoughts. She'd survived, somehow. Against all odds, she'd brought the A-10 down inside friendly lines, taken out the anti-aircraft threat, and lived to tell about it. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like an ending. Her career as a combat pilot was over. She knew it without being told. The injuries would heal, but the Air Force wouldn't let her fly combat missions again. Not after this. She'd pushed her luck too far, and luck had a way of running out. Later that day, Lieutenant Colonel Garrett visited. He sat beside her bed, his face grave. "Reaper, I don't know whether to court-martial you or recommend you for the Medal of Honor." Kine managed a faint smile. "How about neither? Not an option. You disobeyed a direct order to eject. You flew a damaged aircraft into a combat zone. You crashed inside a friendly outpost which could have killed people on the ground. But it didn't." "No, it didn't, because you're either the best pilot I've ever seen or the luckiest. Maybe both." Garrett leaned back, his expression softening. "The wing commander wants to put you up for the Air Force Cross. The soldiers at the outpost are calling you a hero, and the A-10 community is losing its mind over what you did." Kine looked away. "I just did what needed to be done." "I know, that's what makes you who you are." He paused. "But you're done, Reaper. You know that, right? Medical's going to ground you." "Permanently?" Kine nodded slowly. She'd known, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Garrett stood. "For what it's worth, you've had one hell of a career. 438 combat missions, more lives saved than anyone can count, and a legacy that'll outlive all of us." He saluted. Kine returned it, wincing from the pain, and then he was gone and she was alone again, with the end. The recovery took months. Physical therapy for her shoulder, rest for her ribs, medication for the concussion. Kine endured it all with quiet patience, her mind already turning toward what came next. The Air Force Cross ceremony happened while she was still recovering. They held it at the outpost she'd saved, with the soldiers she'd protected standing as witnesses. The medal was heavy, gold and enamel, suspended from a ribbon of blue and white. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy. Despite catastrophic damage to her aircraft, Lieutenant Colonel Kine continued her attack, destroying a critical enemy air defense system and ensuring the survival of coalition forces. Her selfless actions and exceptional skill under fire reflect the highest credit upon herself and the United States Air Force." Kine stood at attention as the wing commander pinned the medal to her uniform. The soldiers applauded. Some of them had tears in their eyes. She didn't. She'd cried all her tears years ago in the dark hours after missions when no one was watching. Now she was just tired. After the ceremony, she walked to the spot where her A-10 had crashed. The wreckage had been cleared away, but the scars remained. Torn earth, scorched ground, a piece of titanium armor plating, half buried in the dirt. She picked it up, brushed off the dust, and slipped it into her pocket. A reminder of what she'd done, of what she'd been, of the aircraft that had carried her through 16 years and 438 missions and never let her down. The next day she flew out on a transport, leaving the desert behind. She didn't look back. There was no point, that part of her life was over. When she returned stateside, the Air Force offered her a desk job, liaison to Congress, public affairs, training command, safe positions, respectable positions, positions that would let her finish her career with dignity. She turned them all down. Instead, she requested a teaching position at the Air Force Weapons School, where the best pilots in the service came to learn how to be better. It was the only thing that made sense. She couldn't fly combat missions anymore, but she could teach the next generation how to do it, how to protect the people on the ground, how to carry the weight, how to be Reaper. The request was approved, and so Kine began the final chapter of her career, not in the cockpit, but in the classroom, passing on what she'd learned, making sure the legacy continued. 3 years later, Kine stood in front of a class of 20 pilots at Nellis Air Force Base. They were the best of the best, hand-picked for the weapons school, hungry to prove themselves. She looked at them and saw echoes of herself decades ago, eager, confident, unaware of what waited for them. Close air support, she began, her voice steady, is not about killing the enemy. It's about saving lives. Every decision you make in the cockpit, every trigger pull, every second of hesitation or action has consequences for the people on the ground. Your job is to make sure those consequences are the ones you intend. She clicked to the next slide. Combat footage. An A-10 gun run, the GAU-8 firing, the ground erupting in dust and fire. This is what it looks like from the cockpit. Clean, controlled, almost beautiful. She clicked again. Ground footage. The same gun run, seen from the perspective of the soldiers being protected. Chaos, terror, the howl of the cannon, the impact shaking the earth. And then silence, safety. This is what it looks like from the ground. Your people, the ones you're protecting, don't see the beauty. They see survival, they see hope, they see you. The classroom was silent. Kine could see the shift in their faces, the beginning of understanding. She spent the next 6 hours walking them through tactics, procedures, case studies. But more than that, she taught them the mindset, the responsibility, the weight. At the end of the day, one of the students, a young captain named Chen, approached her. "Ma'am, I've read about your career. 438 combat missions, the Air Force Cross, the legend of Reaper. I just want to say it's an honor to be taught by you." Kine nodded. "Don't honor me, honor the job, do it right, keep your people alive. That's the only thing that matters." Chen saluted and left. Kine watched him go, and for the first time in years she felt something like peace. She wasn't flying anymore, but she was still fighting, still protecting, still passing on the legacy, and that was enough. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Kine taught class after class, shaping the next generation of close air support pilots. Some of them went on to distinguished careers. Some of them saved lives just as she had. And every time she heard a story about an A-10 pilot keeping a ground unit alive, she felt a quiet pride. The lineage continued. The mission endured. 5 years after her final combat mission, Kine retired from the Air Force. 25 years of service. A career that had taken her from a nervous second lieutenant to a lieutenant colonel with a legacy that would outlive her. The retirement ceremony was small, attended by her squadron, a few senior officers, and a handful of the soldiers and Marines she'd saved over the years. They'd come from across the country, some of them traveling thousands of miles just to be there. To say thank you one more time. Kine stood at the podium looking out at the faces and struggled to find words. She'd never been good at speeches. "I didn't do this alone," she finally said. "Every mission, every gun run, every life saved, it was a team effort. The ground crews who kept my aircraft flying, the intelligence officers who gave me targets, the controllers who talked me onto the enemy, the soldiers and Marines and airmen who held the line on the ground while I circled overhead. This legacy isn't mine, it belongs to all of us." She paused, her voice thick. "The A-10 is more than an aircraft, it's a promise. A promise that when you're in trouble, when everything's gone to hell, someone will be there, Someone will stay. Someone will fight for you. I've tried to keep that promise for 25 years, and I hope the pilots who come after me will keep it too." The applause was long and heartfelt. Afterward, the soldiers and Marines she'd saved lined up to shake her hand. Some of them brought their families, their children, living proof of the lives she'd protected. One Marine, graying now but still strong, gripped her hand tightly. "Ma'am, my daughter just graduated college. She's going to be a teacher. She's alive because of you, because you kept me alive in Helmand 16 years ago." Kine looked at the young woman standing beside him, bright-eyed and smiling, and felt something break open inside her. All the missions, all the fear, all the nightmares. It had been worth it. For this. For the futures she'd made possible. She shook the daughter's hand. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for saving my dad." The ceremony ended. Kine walked out of the hangar and stood on the flight line one last time. A row of A-10s sat on the tarmac ready for their next missions. Ugly, battered, unstoppable. She reached out and touched the nearest one, her hand resting on the fuselage. "Keep them safe," she whispered. And then she turned and walked away, toward a future that didn't include combat. Didn't include the cockpit, but still, somehow included the sky. Retirement was strange. Kine moved to a small town in Colorado near the mountains where the air was thin and clean and the pace of life was measured in seasons instead of missions. She bought a modest house with a view of the peaks, planted a garden, learned to cook meals that didn't come out of a pouch. It should have been peaceful, and sometimes it was, but the nightmares persisted. The valley in Helmand, the ridgelines, the crash inside the outpost. They came less frequently now, but they still came. On those nights, Kine would wake up gasping, her heart pounding, and walk outside to stare at the stars. The sky was different here. No aircraft, no tracers, just stars and silence. She started volunteering at the local Veterans Center, talking to other pilots, other soldiers, other people who'd carried the weight and didn't know how to put it down. She didn't offer easy answers. She just listened. And sometimes that was enough. One day, a young woman approached her after a session. She was in her early 20s, intense and determined, wearing a flight suit with lieutenant's bars. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Brooks. I just finished flight school. I'm headed to A-10 training in a few months." Kine studied her. "What made you choose the Hog?" "You did, ma'am. I read about your career, about the missions, about what you did. I want to be like you. I want to protect people." Kine's expression softened. "Then let me give you some advice." Brooks leaned forward, eager. "Don't try to be like me. Be better. Learn from my mistakes. And remember, every mission is about the people on the ground, not your ego, not your career, them." Brooks nodded, her face serious. "I understand, ma'am." "Good, then go be the pilot they need you to be." Brooks saluted and left. Kine watched her go and felt the lineage continue, the torch passing to the next generation. It was the way it should be. The years passed. Kine grew older, her hair graying, her body slowing. But her mind remained sharp, her memories vivid. She wrote a book about her experiences, not to glorify war, but to honor the people she'd fought alongside. The soldiers and Marines and airmen who'd bled and died and survived. The book was published quietly, without fanfare, but it found its audience. Pilots read it, ground troops read it, families of the fallen read it, and they understood. They understood what it meant to fly into danger, to stay when others left, to keep the promise. 10 years after her retirement, Kine received an invitation. The Air Force was hosting a ceremony at Nellis Air Force Base to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the A-10's first flight. They wanted her to speak, to represent the pilots who'd flown the aircraft in combat, who'd proven its worth, who'd kept the promise. Kine almost declined. She didn't like the spotlight, didn't want the attention. But then she thought about the young pilots who'd be there, the next generation, and she accepted. The ceremony was massive. Hundreds of people, active duty pilots, veterans, families, media, and at the center of the flight line a pristine A-10, freshly painted, engines gleaming. Kine stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. She was 70 now, her face lined, her hands steady. When she spoke, her voice carried. "The A-10 Thunderbolt II is not the fastest aircraft. It's not the stealthiest. It's not the most advanced. But for 50 years it has done something no other aircraft can do. It has stayed. When the mission gets ugly, when the enemy is close, when the people on the ground are desperate, the A-10 shows up and it doesn't leave. It fights, it protects, it brings people home." She paused, her eyes sweeping the crowd. I flew this aircraft for 16 years, 438 combat missions, and every single time I strapped in, I knew I was part of something bigger than myself. I was part of a legacy of pilots who understood that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and flying anyway, because people are counting on you. Her voice grew stronger. To the pilots who flew before me, thank you. You set the standard. To the pilots who fly now, thank you. You keep the promise. And to the pilots who will fly in the future, remember this: the aircraft doesn't make you great. Your actions do. Your decisions. Your willingness to stay when others leave. That's what makes you Reaper. The crowd erupted in applause. Kind stepped back from the podium, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it, the pride, the gratitude, the sense of completion. After the ceremony, she walked to the A-10 on display. She climbed the ladder just as she'd done 1,000 times before and sat in the cockpit. The seat fit her perfectly, even after all these years. She rested her hands on the stick and throttles, her eyes closed, remembering the missions, the gun runs, the people she'd saved, the weight she'd carried, and for just a moment she was young again, flying, fighting, keeping the promise. Then she opened her eyes, climbed down, and walked away. The sky would always be there, but her time in it was done. Kind spent her final years in quiet reflection. She stayed in touch with the pilots she'd trained, the soldiers she'd saved, the legacy she'd built. They sent her letters, photos of their families, stories of missions flown and lives saved. Each one was a reminder that the work continued, that the promise endured. On a crisp autumn morning, 23 years after her final combat mission, Kind sat on her porch and watched the sunrise. The mountains were painted gold and orange, the sky vast and clear. Her body was failing now. The doctors had told her months ago, cancer aggressive and unstoppable. She'd refused treatment. She'd lived long enough, done enough. She was ready. As the sun climbed higher, she heard it, faint at first, then growing louder. The unmistakable sound of turbofan engines. An A-10. Kind stood, leaning on her cane, and watched as the aircraft appeared over the mountains. It flew low, just a few hundred feet above the valley, the pilot likely on a training mission. The A-10 passed overhead, and Kind raised her hand in salute. The pilot must have seen her, because the aircraft waggled its wings. Once, twice. A final acknowledgement, a final goodbye. Kind lowered her hand and smiled. The lineage continued, the promise endured, and she could rest. That evening, as the sun set and the stars emerged, Nora Kind closed her eyes for the last time. She'd lived a life defined by courage and sacrifice and the relentless commitment to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She'd been Reaper, the pilot who didn't leave, the one who stayed. And when the SEALs had stopped moving, when the raiders had fallen silent, when the Marines had looked up at the sky in desperation, she'd been there. Flying low and slow and dangerous, keeping the promise, bringing them home. Her body was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery among the warriors who'd come before. Her headstone was simple, just her name, her rank, and her call sign, Reaper. And beneath it the date that had defined her career, 14/07/2009, the day she'd become a legend, the day she'd proven that one pilot in one aircraft could change everything. The funeral was attended by hundreds, pilots from across the Air Force, soldiers and Marines from across the country, families of the people she'd saved. They stood in silence as the honor guard folded the flag, as the jets flew overhead in missing man formation, as the bugler played taps. And when it was over, they didn't leave immediately. They stayed, they shared stories, they remembered, they honored. Years passed. The A-10 continued to fly, its legacy intertwined with pilots like Kind who'd proven its worth in blood and fire. The aircraft was upgraded, modernized, kept in service long after critics said it should be retired. Because the generals and planners and strategists had learned what the ground troops always knew. When things went bad, when the mission got ugly, you wanted the warthog overhead. You wanted the pilot who wouldn't leave. In training squadrons across the Air Force, instructors told stories of legendary CAS pilots, and always inevitably they told the story of Reaper, the pilot who'd flown 438 combat missions, who'd saved countless lives, who'd crashed a burning aircraft inside a friendly outpost to take out an enemy air defense system, who'd kept the promise every single time. Young pilots listened, wide-eyed, and asked if the stories were true. and the instructors would nod. Every word. Reaper was real, and she set the standard. Some of those young pilots went on to distinguished careers of their own. They flew combat missions in new conflicts, new theaters, new wars. And when things got desperate, when the people on the ground were in trouble, they remembered Reaper. They remembered the promise, and they stayed. The lineage continued. At Nellie's Air Force Base in the Hall of Honor, a plaque was installed. It bore Kine's name, her rank, her call sign, and a single sentence. She flew so others could live. Beneath it, a photo. Kine in her flight suit, helmet under her arm, standing in front of her A-10. Her face was calm, determined, touched by the weight she carried. But in her eyes there was something else. Purpose, pride, peace. Visitors to the hall would stop and read the plaque. Some of them were pilots who understood. Some of them were civilians who didn't, but all of them felt it. The presence of something greater. The legacy of a warrior who'd given everything to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And in the sky above, the A-10s continued to fly. Ugly, unstoppable, keeping the promise. Because that's what they were built to do. Because that's what Reaper had taught them. Even now, decades after her final mission, her influence endured. In the tactics taught at the weapons school. In the mindset drilled into every close air support pilot. In the stories told around squadron bars. She was gone. But she wasn't forgotten, and the sky would never forget her, because legends don't die, they just take flight, forever circling, forever watching, forever protecting. Reaper.